Good morning. If I got to ask everybody to just take their seats, please, so we can start today's event. So thank you very much for everybody that's here in person, here in Washington, D.C. at Georgetown University to attend the third AI in Action conference series. We welcome all those that are here in person that come from intergovernmental organizations, that come from academia, that come from governmental organizations, that come from think tanks. For those that are students, we welcome you for a very active and engaging conference on AI. I'd also like to welcome the multitude of people that are joining us here this morning online. Our last check was that we have people from 5 continents participating in this event from a multitude of backgrounds, mostly policy, academia, and industry. So the objective of these conferences is to really create a platform where how we've defined the key stakeholders of AI can come together and share knowledge at the frontier. And those are academics, industry experts, and policymakers. The title of today's theme is Jobs in the Future of AI. And we think that that topic is quite poignant, given the interest in this topic. I think all one person needs to do is take a quick tertiary look at their media platform and realize that it is awash with articles, people concerned about where their jobs will be today and where their kids' jobs will be tomorrow. So the objective of this event is really to take a close, up-front look at these questions. And to do so, we're joined with academics that are researching these questions, very recent papers that have been published. Most of them are working papers and haven't been published. We also are joined with academics, industry experts that are currently working at leading global companies that are implementing AI, and they have a real upfront look at how this is impacting jobs and skills. And finally, we're joined with policy experts that have an understanding regarding the types of regulatory environments that are beginning to pop up around the world in terms of how we think about regulating artificial intelligence. We're very happy to have everybody here in person, and we look forward to having a very eager and active discussion, both with people in person, but also online. We're going to kick off the conference today with a keynote from Professor Carl Frey. Professor Carl Frey is from the University of Oxford, and in my mind, and as well as many others around the world, he's one of the leading experts on AI and jobs. I remember first reading Carl's work back when I was a policy analyst at the OECD. He had a very early paper that came out in 2013, which looked at the economic implications of computerization and automation on jobs. I have since cited that work many times, but I'm sure Carl has not realized that whatsoever. But I'm not surprised, because that paper's been cited 16,000 times and has actually become a method of trying to predict what types of jobs are going to be susceptible for, at that time was computerization and automation, but now it's AI. And when I was at the OECD, I saw people considering that methodology. I've seen it considered and implemented at the World Bank and the IMF, as well as within our own government here in the United States. So we're really lucky to have Carl Frey. Today, he's going to give a very exciting presentation, which looks at AI and the future of work, lessons from history. So without further ado, I'd really like to welcome Carl Frey to the stage, so please give him a hand.
Thank you very much, Tim, for that very generous introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here with you today and having the opportunity to share with you some of the research that we are doing at Oxford Internet Institute, where we try to understand how artificial intelligence is reshaping the world of work and draw some lessons from history as well, because we've been through many technological revolutions before, from steam to electricity to computers. Some things rhyme better, some things rhyme better than others, but I think that we can learn something by picking the right analogies, and that's something I will try to convince you of during my talk today. Many refer to artificial intelligence as the new electricity. And if that is true, we certainly have many things to look forward to, because electricity made our cities brighter and safer. It made our factories, offices, and workplaces less polluted and much more comfortable. And it essentially allowed people at lower incomes who didn't have servants to do the most tedious things for them to get their own electric servants, as vacuum cleaners, washing machines, refrigerators, toasters, etc., proliferated across our homes. But that doesn't mean that everybody benefited from electrification. If you were a lamplighter, chances are that you didn't welcome the arrival of electric streetlights. And indeed, here in Washington, D.C. and in many other cities, lamplighters were the ones who lit our streets at night and made it possible for us to reach our homes safely. They were walking the street with torches and ladders, and they were able to support themselves and their families that way. And so in the city of Brussels, when electric streetlights was introduced, lamplighters naturally went on strike. The city council then enrolled another group of lamplighters who then clashed with their own lamplighters. The situation escalated, ended with the lamplighters raiding police headquarters, and the army was sent in to resolve the situation. And so we should remember that the force of technology, although it has brought much good, is a disruptive force as well. And as economists, to some degree rightly, we tend to take a very long-run view of technological change, right? And you've probably seen this graph many times before, the hockey stick of economic growth and well-being, etc., which sort of turns upright around 1800, when the first industrial revolution takes root in Britain and then proliferates across the world. And many feel that we're in this new technological revolution with artificial intelligence, and we're in for one of these other accelerations. But I think we can learn something from looking at the actual period of industrialization, which was not just a story of rising incomes, but also significant disruption. Much like today, people have very different views of it. So Benjamin Disraeli, before he became Prime Minister of Britain, in this book called Coningsby, in which one character remarks that I see cities peopled with machines, certainly Manchester must be the most wonderful place of modern times. The very same year that Coningsby was published, Frederick Engels published his work on the condition of the working class in England, which was written during a stay in precisely Manchester. And needless to say, Engels had a very different view on what machinery was doing to the workforce. He first of all argued that the mechanized factory put people in the repetitive motions of machinery, which he deemed to be unnatural. After all, previously people had worked surrounded by their families at their home, at their own pace, not at the pace of the factory clock. And he also, along with many contemporary economists, didn't believe that it would improve living standards. He argued that mechanization would, if anything, drive down wages and lead to the immiseration of the working class. And it's not hard to understand why he thought that. All he had to do was look around the fate of the handloom weaver, who disappeared as steam power was adopted and weaving was mechanized. And what you see here is the earnings of a handloom weaver relative to a construction worker who would have been unaffected by mechanization, and incomes just collapse as the factory system proliferates. And this is not an isolated example. During the period, sort of the classic period of the Industrial Revolution, as the British economy takes off and grows by some 50% between 1770 and 1840, wages are basically stagnant. They grow by 12% over this period, and they probably fall at the lower end end of the income distribution. So the wage data is not great here, but if you look at biological indicators of well-being, such as height, you see that the cohorts born in 1850 are actually shorter than the cohorts born in 1850. If you look on data on consumption, you find a similar trend. People have less resources available for non-essentials, for example, right? And so this is also the period of a lot of not just technological revolution, but political revolutionary activities. The famous Luddite riots were actually not an isolated situation, but part of a long wave of riots that swept across Britain, that swept across continental Europe, that swept across China as well. And one reason, as I argue in my book, that the first industrial revolution happened in Britain and not on the continent, or indeed not in China, is that the Luddites were actually relatively weak, and they were crushed by the British Army, who vehemently resisted anything that they felt threatened Britain's position in trade, whereas the political clout of the crafticals persisted much longer on the continent and indeed in China. And so there's nothing inevitable about technological progress advancing, especially when large groups in the population stand to lose out to technological change and progress. Now, the key takeaway from this is not that we are about to relive the same episode all over again. But I think it's noteworthy that just as income inequality increased quite dramatically in both Britain and the United States during the early stages of industrialization, it's been increasing again since the 1980s. And I'm certainly not suggesting that the only factor that has driven income inequality over the past 2 centuries is technology, but it's a key part of the story. And over the long run, it is essentially what drives patterns of income and wage growth. But there's not a monotonic relationship, right? There are different types of technologies. Some are more replacing, some are more enabling. So if you think of a technology like the automatic elevator, all it did was getting rid of the operator. If you take a technology like the telescope, it's hard to think of a single person it would have replaced, right? It allowed us to do new and previously inconceivable things, like looking at the moons of Jupiter. And obviously, there's a host of examples that are somewhere in between. If you take the automobile, for example, it did replace horse carriages, but it created the largest manufacturing industry in the United States. It created a host of supplier industries for the components needed to go into a car. It created a host of industries needed to produce the machine tools to make those components. It gave rise to personalized transportation for the first time for the masses of the population. That way it gave rise to road commerce, travel, tourism, etc. It's probably hard to think of a technology that will have created more new tasks and activities for labor. And of course, in the early 20th century, it was not the only game in town. Electrical industries were proliferating as well. And unlike the first industrial revolution, which primarily centered on the factory system replacing the domestic system in textile production and essentially automated an existing industry, electrification created a host of new electrical industries, which in turn absorbed more labor. And that is, again, quite different from the sort of post-1980s experience. The growth of the second industrial revolution industry essentially petered out in the 1970s, and after that, computers have been sort of a chief driver of productivity growth. And of course, the process of computerization goes back much further, right? So you can date it, in the 17th century if you like, but I think it's more common to date it around the invention of the ENIAC, which was the first electronic computer invented at the University of Pennsylvania, not too far from here. But it consisted of 18,000 vacuum tubes, could not have been fitted into this room, and as a result, it did not have much impact on the world of work. It really took the microprocessor and a personal computer for computers to begin to have an impact on the labor market. And that is something we see around the 1980s, when productivity and wages begin to decouple, again, much like the first industrial revolution, suggesting that we have these automation technologies putting downward pressure on wages and decoupling from economic growth. And more importantly, I would argue, because most people earn their income through wages, it led to very significant reshufflings in the labor market as well, right? So up until roughly 1970 in the United States, you see wages grow at all ranks of the income distribution, whether you're a high school dropout, whether you're a college graduate, whether you're a man, whether you're a woman, your wages grow. Around 1970, wages stagnate for everybody, and then around 1980, you see this gap emerging, particularly among prime-age men and those who had no more than a high school degree, who would have flocked into the factories before automation began. And obviously there are a variety of explanations for this trend, and I don't mean to suggest that we can pin this down to one single factor, but I think that sort of two key drivers both have something to do with technology, and that's globalization and automation, right? Because it would be completely unfeasible for firms around the world to manage complex supply chains and offshore production to places like China without information technology and computers that allow us to coordinate these activities at distance. But even if you look at China, we're actually seeing peak manufacturing there, right? So manufacturing employment has fallen significantly since 2017. And if you look at the United States, we're still producing a lot of stuff here. What's been declining is not the manufacturing share of output, but the manufacturing share of employment. And of course, we now have more direct evidence of the impact of automation technologies on jobs to look to as well. And I suspect that many of you will be familiar with some of these studies. But let me highlight some points that some might be less familiar with, which is that when a job is automated, it doesn't just impact the person who loses his or her job. It impacts that entire family, and it impacts the future prospects of the children in that family and in that community as well, because it means that there are fewer future employment opportunities, and it means that that family has fewer resources to actually invest in their children. And so what you're getting is quite long-lasting impacts on these communities where automation has proliferated. And what work by Berger and Excel shows, for example, is that social mobility is significantly lower in places where robots have proliferated. And I think that helps us understand some of the political events that we've been seeing recently as well, not unlike the first industrial revolution with the Luddites. If you want to understand the outcome of the 2016 election, again, you can't put it on one factor, but Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, all part of the Democratic Blue Belt, won by Trump in 2016, had one thing in common: they were heavily exposed to automation technologies. And this is not just something we're seeing in the United States, it is something that we're seeing across Europe as well. Even in my home country, Sweden, where we have perhaps a bit more generous welfare systems, we see that the Swedish Democrats are doing particularly well in communities more exposed to automation. So a key question for us then going forward is artificial intelligence likely to be a continuation of this trajectory, or could it potentially constitute a reversal of it? And broadly speaking, we have sort of two strands of literature to point to here. One set of studies, which I'm sure we'll hear more about later, because one of the authors is here today, and they very nicely show that it's high-income jobs that are most exposed to technologies like ChatGPT, which is intuitive, right? If you do writing, if you do coding, if you do this kind of activities that are relatively high skill, you're more exposed to these type of technologies, but it doesn't necessarily tell us whether those activities are automated or augmented. Then second strand of studies are more experimental in nature and essentially consist of randomly assigning generative AI technologies to people. And what you find there is that whether in repetitive customer service, whether in coding or writing, it's actually novices and low-skill workers that benefit the most from the use of these technologies. And that seems to me intuitive, right? If you're Dostoevsky, you're not going to benefit a huge amount from ChatGPT, whereas if you're not a very good writer like myself, then you benefit a lot more. And so, arguably, this means that people with lower levels of skill will find it easier to enter these types of occupations. And I think one way of thinking about this is similar to what happened with taxi services as Uber proliferated, right? So, before GPS technology in Uber, it was a valuable skill to know the name of every street here in Georgetown. I managed to find this venue quite easily from my hotel with the help of GPS technology, although I got intentionally lost on the way because it's so nice here, so I had a little walk around. But those skills are generally not as valuable today. And with the Uber platform, essentially anybody who wants to drive and earn a little bit of income on the side can get into his and her car. And what that obviously means is lower barriers to entry into taxi services, more competition, which has, in the case of taxi services, driven down wages for incumbents. And a key question going forward is, what's the elasticity of demand, which is to say how much more will we consume of these goods as they get cheaper with regard to generative AI? My hunch is that there's probably not going to be that much, because think of it this way: how much more Netflix would you consume if the subscription fee is halved and the content becomes much better? Well, probably not that much, because like in my case, your day is capped by 24 hours and you can't sit around watching Netflix all day, although that's probably a bit overstating it, because with generative AI you can potentially also consume more content, right? You can ask it to read through more reports and synthesize and summarize the key findings for you. But I strongly suspect that incumbents in content creating professions will feel the force of competition quite keenly. And I think the effect is likely to be more significant than in Uber, because obviously taxi services are non-traded, and most activities aided by generative AI are traded. And there are some very significant income disparities across space. So if you're an accountant in New York City, you are making a 6-digit salary. If you're in Manila, you're making around 3,000 per year. And part of these differentials reflect differences in productivity. If you now throw generative AI into the equation and it diminishes some of those productivity differentials, then you might think that that is providing some quite compelling incentives for offshoring, and that would not be a huge departure from what we've seen over the past decade, where trade in goods has slowed down and trade in services has surged ahead. And as I usually tell my students, the future of growth is likely to look more like India than in China, being based more on services than on manufactured goods, which peaked a long time ago. At the same time, though, if you look at online platforms and online labor, you do find some interesting patterns, and I think we ought to ask ourselves why very few countries have actually, reached anything near middle-income status through trading services. And so, if you look at where vacancies are in online platforms, they're primarily in places like the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, India. If you look at where the workers are, it's in India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, United Kingdom. I think you see what all of these countries have in common. It's the English language, right? And obviously, language matters a lot more if you're trading services rather than goods. But here too, I think AI can be helpful. Something that we see in work in progress is that already technologies like Google Translate has reduced the demand for language skills, and as we're getting more real-time translation capabilities, I think it's likely that trade in services will become available to a growing set of countries. Of course, AI going forward is not just going to lead to offshoring, it's going to have some impacts, I think, through automation as well. What you see in many of these exposure studies is that there's a lot of tasks that are exposed by very few occupations. But if you took the task-based analysis and applied it to a lot of occupations historically, you would have concluded that they were non-automatable, right? And so we didn't automate the jobs of lamplighters by building robots capable of climbing lampposts. We did that by rolling out electricity and controlling them from substation. We didn't automate away the jobs of laundresses by building robots that will walk down to well, perform the motions of hand washing, and then walk back to the house and hang the clothes to dry. We did that by inventing the electric washing machine. We didn't automate away the jobs of medieval craftsmen by building robots doing the exact same motions. We did that by simplifying that work in a factory setting and then applying specialized machinery to those particular simplified tasks, right? So task simplification is absolutely key to automation, and I can assure you that when autonomous vehicles arrive, nobody will be holding the steering wheel, so finger dexterity will not be needed. When you apply that intuition, I think you will find that it's quite a different set of occupations that are exposed, and it's also quite hard to actually assess which those jobs are. Back in 2013, the paper that Tim kindly mentioned, we tried to get at this in an admittedly imperfect way by saying that there are basically sort of three key bottlenecks to automation that cannot be alleviated through task simplification, that are hard to alleviate through task simplification. So two of them being creativity and social intelligence, where actually we've seen considerable progress over the past decade in ways that we did not anticipate, but broadly speaking, I still think sort of those intuitions hold, right? Think about it this way. Generative AI is very good at virtual communication or text communication. But in such a world, how do you distinguish yourself? The only way to distinguish yourself is through in-person communication. If everybody has their generative AI to sell products, for example, they're likely to be quite equally matched. And so I would predict that in-person social skills, the value of those skills, are likely to increase as a consequence of that. Creativity is obviously a harder one because it's hard to define what creativity is, and obviously, generative AI can be creative in some ways. But the reason that it can write a letter in the style of William Shakespeare is that Shakespeare existed in the first place, right? And that provides you with some benchmark of what a letter written by Shakespeare should look like. And if you don't have Shakespeare, what is the reward function? What are you trying to optimize for? Figuring that out is where much creativity resides. In similar fashion, I think if you think about a technology like aviation, right? If you had asked ChatGPT or another LLM in 1900, based on all information that was available, are humans likely to be able to fly? We'd probably have looked at past attempts to fly. It might have looked to data on birds and concluded that there is no bird that weighs more than 50 pounds that is capable of flying, and so any airplane that weighs more than 50 pounds is doomed not to be able to fly, which suggests to me that theory might still be important, that entrepreneurs and innovators, what they do is like a talk in itself, but it's definitely more than just extrapolating from the past. Now, to some degree, though, we've seen inroads in both creativity and complex social interactions. And I'm totally open to the possibility that if I'm invited back here in 10 years' time, which is very much an open question, I might be looking very silly in hindsight. And it's possible that we've seen extraordinary progress and that these bottlenecks around creativity and complex social interactions have been overcome. But there are a number of reasons why I think that is not likely, at least, to be the case. Or if it is the case, I think it's unlikely to be because of the systems that we currently have, right? So I think one concern is Moore's law. So the models that we currently have are essentially based on bigger compute and bigger data. And I think there are some concerns about Moore's law petering out. There are further concerns around the availability of training data, which we can discuss later as well. But many of these foundational models have essentially already been trained on the bulk of the internet, and there are questions around how much more data will be around to scale up these models going forward, and it's actually quite likely that the internet will deteriorate as a training source of data because it's likely to be flooded by AI-generated content. Some of that might be alleviated by synthetic data, but obviously synthetic data can only be as good as the sort of simulations that we do. And the question is how capable we are of simulating the real world. If that was easy, I suspect we would have had driverless cars a long time ago. But finally, and I think more fundamentally, and there is certainly a lot of disagreement about this, but I think there's quite compelling evidence to suggest that what these systems that we have today are doing is more memorizing rather than generalizing, right? So to give an example, it's much more impressive if AI system is able to pass an exam and it hasn't had access to the right answer as during training. And one way of testing this is sort of introducing new questions that it would not have been exposed to prior to training or sort of after the cutoff date up until which it will have been trained. And what those studies show is that performance declines very significantly when you do that, and it's often no better than chance. And so what that means is that we can never really be certain with the current state of the technology on how it will actually perform when it encounters novel circumstances, right? So take the example of the game of Go. I suspect most people in this room will have heard of 2016 AlphaGo beats the world champion. I suspect fewer people will have heard that last year actually amateurs with the help of standard computers beat the best Go algorithm by quite easily by exposing it to positions it would never have encountered in training. And I think what this tells us is that we can never be quite sure how these systems respond when novel circumstances emerge. And a key feature of human intelligence is our ability to actually deal with novel circumstances quite resiliently on the basis of a few examples, right? So I think it is quite unlikely that we will entrust very significant tasks to AI unless we have a better handle on those challenges. Now, 10 years ago, when we wrote our study, our key conclusion was that AI is predominantly an automation technology that focuses on increasing efficiency in tasks that humans already do. And very little of what we've seen over the past 10 years have led me to change my mind on that particular point. Even the poster child of AI in science, AlphaFold, is essentially about automation. It is about folding proteins, which humans were doing before, but at much greater speed. Now, I don't want to diminish the accomplishment. It's a very, very useful technology, but it's not about doing completely new things. And one of the key themes of my latest book is that when you have periods of labor replacing technical change, you also tend to have more unrest and resistance. And I think Leontief was onto something when he suggested that if horses could have voted and joined the Democratic Party, what happened on the farms might have been different. They might have used their political voice to bring the introduction of the tractor to a halt. But I think more significantly, if all we do is automation, then we're actually not even making the pie that much bigger, right? If all we had done since 1800 was just automation, we would have cheap textiles and productive agriculture, but not much else, right? We wouldn't have vaccines, antibiotics, airplanes, cars, computers, etc., etc. Most growth actually comes from enabling technologies. So I think a key task for policymakers going forward is thinking about how we can make technological change more enabling. I'm not going to pretend to have the answer, but I think there are at least a number of things that can be done, right? So we do have quite compelling evidence about our ability to shift the trajectory of technological change, not least in climate technology, where we see that, when fossil fuels become more expensive, we tend to invest more in less fossil fuel intensive technologies. When data becomes more expensive, we tend to invest less in data intensive technologies. And using similar intuition, people like Darren Acemoglu and Pascal Restrepo have shown that the tax code has aided automation over the past couple of decades. Taxes on payroll have been increasing, taxes on capital have generally been falling. That means that businesses are more likely to invest in automation technologies as a consequence of that, and we can use the tax code to shape those incentives. Finally, I think just through competition dynamics, a lot can be achieved, right? Different firms tend to invest in different technologies, right? If you're a large company, you tend to have scale, and you tend to focus on producing what you're already doing to as many people as possible, and you're more likely to invest in automation and process technology. smaller firms which don't have scale are more likely to bring in new products that are more likely to create new tasks and new type of industries for labor to move into. And a key challenge, I think, is that business dynamism has been in decline. It used to be the case that profits predicted entry in an industry. If you go back to the 1970s, that has essentially broken down since the 1990s, which suggests that there are quite significant barriers to entry across a host of industries for these startups to come in. And what you're then left with is more focus on automation rather than enabling technological change. So with that said, I look forward to your questions and the later conversation. And thank you very much for having me. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you very much.
So we're now going to have Q&A for about 15 minutes or so. That was an excellent talk. Thank you very much. So we've had several questions coming through from our online audience, and when people registered, I'm sure you've also got questions here. So to try and be fair to everyone, I'll first take a couple from our online audience, and then I'll go and take a couple in-house. So when we get to that, if you just raise your hand, we'll get a microphone to you, and then you can ask your question. So if we start with the people online, so this question has come through from many, many people. We've had Rizkyemi Rimbani from Indonesia, Mori Kogid from Malaysia, Usanine Rethong from Thailand. Sorry about my pronunciation for these names. And they're all worried about job losses, as Tim sort of mentioned in his introduction. And particularly as AI starts to improve. And they're asking what types of tasks and jobs are likely to be replaced in the short term, and as AI improves and gets better over time, how do you see that changing? Is higher unemployment inevitable?
So as mentioned in my talk, I think actually the location of some of the people you mentioned means that they are actually more likely to benefit from the AI revolution, in the sense that if we have a technology like generative AI reducing productivity differentials across space, people in places where lower incomes are more likely to see economic activity shift there. But that shift is no longer going to be around manufacturing. It's more likely to be around services. So I'm sort of cautiously optimistic in that regard. That is not to suggest that there are not going to be labor market disruptions in emerging economies. But I think when you look at sort of outright automation and job displacement, rather than changes in the task content of work or sort of the automation of individual tasks on online platform, it's more jobs in warehouses, in transportation logistics, in some sort of in-person services like work of cashiers, for example, where we're seeing and receptionists, where we're seeing that outright automation is more likely. What I think has been concerning in places like India, which have sort of grown through service-led growth, is that youth unemployment is still extraordinarily high. And so I don't know enough about India in particular to sort of decompose to why that is. But at the same time, I think that ICT services can provide an escalator for the expansion of employment also in occupations which are not related to that directly, right? And one thing that we see very clearly in the United States is that the labor multiplier is quite large for ICT in particular. So one new tech job created tends to create 5 new jobs in the local service economy. And that multiplier effect is even larger in emerging economies where wage differential between low income and high income are even greater. So I'm cautiously optimistic for those places, actually.
Great. So one related question. is about the skills needed to productively work with AI. And particularly people are asking about education and training systems, how do you see they may need to adapt? And are there some skills that become maybe less important and some that become more important?
Oh, absolutely. So I think, a lot of educational reform in a number of OECD countries have focused on coding, right? And right now it's, far from clear whether that was a wise decision or not, because, generative AI, it turns out, is actually quite a helpful tool for coding. In particular, maybe what we should invest more in is statistics, which is a transferable skill set in the sense that it allows you to make also more informed decisions in life broadly, in addition to understanding how some of these systems function at least a bit better. But I also think that soft skills do really matter. As I mentioned earlier, if most of the interaction you do or that we automate in the virtual space, what that's likely to mean is that it's going to increase the value of in-person communication, right? So if AI writes all your love letters and everybody else's, right? The first date becomes more important. How do you distinguish yourself? And I do think that's likely to be the case.
Great. So I'll take a couple of questions from the audience. If you want to raise your hand, there's someone at the back. If we could get a microphone.
Hi, my name is Mark McCarthy. I'm here at Georgetown with the CCT program and associated with the Center for Business and Public Policy. Thank you for a great talk. That was a super overview of these issues. I want to go back to the comment you made about the limitations on artificial intelligence. And one that you mentioned was its difficulty in dealing with novel circumstances. And I want to pose the question of what that means for work. If that limitation really is intrinsic to the machine learning approach, that's the dominant form of AI these days, then the implications for something like self-driving cars are enormous, because they can recognize a truck, but if a truck has fallen over on its side, that hasn't been part of their training data. So there are limitations on self-driving cars replacing human drivers. And that may be intrinsic to a large number of these applications. If you try to do the symbolic approach, which is the other way of doing it, that's not so much better in novel circumstances either. So how do you see these technologies really being integrated into the economy in the context where they aren't that useful in those circumstances where unanticipated, unexpected new things arise, and human beings can deal with that, but the machines we've trained don't have the capacity to do that?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question first of all. So I think a key reason why we don't have driverless cars but we have generative AI is that we are just more risk averse when it comes to driverless cars, right? And so, accidents are irreversible in the physical space. If generative AI produces content that's flawed, that can have consequences as well, but in most instances you can correct for that, right? So we're just much more risk averse in those domains, and rightly so. And I think when it comes to things like managing supply chains and managing inventory, for example, AI performs very well under normal circumstances, and that's most of the time. But then when you have a supply shock, like COVID, for example, firms that use those kind of technologies are likely to struggle more. And so you have to make a sort of cost-benefit calculation. What is the productivity gains you get from this during normal periods versus the costs that you incur during these very specific situations. I mean, it's not situations that are completely unfamiliar to economists, right? If we, key reason why we have agriculture subsidies is that, we are telling ourselves that we need to have some food supply domestically in the case of, outbreak of a war or something like that. And so we're taxing ourselves every year where we can, probably get cheaper food from somewhere else for that, possibility. And so, you can make it back on the envelope calculation, how much are you paying for that each year, and what is the likelihood that you actually encounter those sort of terrible scenarios.
Do we have any more questions from the audience? Yeah, there's another one.
Hi, Jeffrey Frank. I'm a student at the McDonough School of Business in the Flex program, and I am also an attorney at the Department of Transportation. But my views and my question here are my own. I'm curious if you have any thoughts, or if of any research that's been done that sort of connects back sort of the experience being on the other side of generative AI in terms of responding to it with the experience of working with it. So, for example, could a government agency that has experience working with AI decision support systems be better at handling the regulation of similar systems out in the world? Or is there any sort of evidence or information out there to the effect that sort of just having the experience with it, these systems allows people to sort of better respond when other people are using the same ones?
I'm not aware of particular studies to that end, but it sounds intuitive to me, and I think it's one of the reasons why you have to often have this revolving door between business and government, although it leads to some concerns around cronyism, etc. But the knowledge sharing is very important, and I think there is a reason that European Union, for example, has taken lead in AI regulation, which is that they have a lot of experience with regulation for sort of from the development of the GDPR and other things. So clearly you have learning by doing in regulation and policy as well. And when it comes to the regulation of technology, clearly knowledge of the technology itself helps. So I do buy the premise of your question.
I think there was one more, yes.
Hi, good morning. Ana Gusolito from the World Bank. As a mobile on Restrepo, I have many papers where they help us sort of to rationalize the impact of technological change on jobs. And they talk originally about the displacement effect, which is something that you mentioned, but they show in general equilibrium models that actually wages will go down and the economy eventually dynamically will sort of reallocate resources and foster the creation of new activities where these workers that were originally displaced were somehow reincorporated into the labor force. And the second effect is sort of called the reinstatement effect. So I am wondering if you have evidence for developing countries about the role of AI in sort of helping economies speed up the transition from the displacement to the reinstatement effect, and if you have any thoughts on that as well.
It's a very interesting question. So I'm aware of a number of startups that try to support the process, relocation process you describe, using AI. And so Eightfold and Retrain AI are two examples of that. In the context of developing countries, I'm not too familiar with the proliferation of that kind of services. And I also haven't seen much in terms of evidence in how far it actually supports successful relocations. And so, many instances of obviously, information is one hurdle, but there are also cost of moving, cost of housing, different regulatory regimes around occupational licensing, etc., which makes it hard to move. That matters too, right? And so, AI and the help in matching can only take you so far. I do think, though, that remote work in particular is likely to mean that you get better matches and less friction. And so I think when it comes to services in particular, where most of the action is likely to be going forward, that is an encouraging part of the story. But I don't have any success stories to point you towards, unfortunately.
Great. So I think that brings us to the end of this session. Thank you so much, Carl. I know you're around all morning, so people can grab him later in a coffee break if you have more questions. So we're going to go straight into the next session, which is a series of academic presentations on how AI is affecting existing jobs, some already referred to by Carl in his presentation. We're going to have Lee Brandstetter, Manuel Hoffman, and Sam Manning. Each presenter will present for up to 20 minutes, and then at the end of all three presentations, we're going to get all the presenters up for Q&A at the end. So hold your questions until the end of the three presentations. So it's Lee Brandstetter first up. Thank you, Carl.
Thanks.